Jouzu, Jouzu.
When you're first starting to learn about Japanese verbs, it can be pretty daunting seeing all these weird conjugations and whatnot. Heck, when I first started learning Japanese, I didn't even know what a verb was. But don't you worry, because in this 4-part series, we'll cover how native Japanese speakers learn about verbs and what the textbooks don't tell you. This is the first part of the series, and we'll cover how Japanese people divide verbs into 2 categories. But first, just to cover all grounds, verbs are action terms. That's literally translated from the Japanese doshi, meaning verb. When you talk about some sort of action, that is a verb. And in Japanese, every single verb ends on a u-ro kana. So that's how you can identify a verb in Japanese. Knowing that, let's talk about the 2 types of verbs, starting with a little exercise. I want you to try to continue this pattern here, starting with the first verb aruku, meaning walk. If we wanted to make this formal, we would add mas and turn this into arukimasu. Okay, great. Next we have nomu, meaning drink. And if we want to turn this into mas form, we do the same thing and we get nomimasu. Pretty easy to understand so far. So next we have oyogu, meaning swim, turns into oyogimasu. And finally, the next one, hashiru, run, hashirimasu. Okay, I hope you see the pattern. So logically, the next word, kiru, meaning wear, would be kirimasu, right? The correct mas form for kiru is kimasu.
NANI?
So why is it that for all of these verbs up here, the u changes into an I, but not kiru? Well, the answer is that all of these verbs up here are Godan verbs, while kiru is an Ichidan verb. These are the 2 types of verbs we'll be dealing with today, the Godan verbs and the Ichidan verbs. There are also 2 more irregular verbs called fukisoku doshi. And that's not to say that there's not more irregular verbs in Japanese, I'm just saying that as it pertains to this video, we just have 2 to worry about. Okay, so let's take a closer look at Ichidan verbs. These are single stem verbs, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. First, to identify an Ichidan verb, it must end on an iru or an eru. That is to say, it must end with an i-ro kana plus a ru, or an e-ro kana plus a ru. Examples of Ichidan verbs are miru, to see, taberu, to eat, or kiru, to wear. I have underlined the romaji so you can clearly see where the iru and eru are. This is as opposed to something like kiku, which ends on a ku, not a ru, therefore this cannot be an Ichidan verb. Or wakaru, which does end on a ru, but it ends on a ru, meaning this is not an Ichidan verb. But please pay attention to this. All Ichidan verbs must end with iru or eru, but not all iru and eru ending verbs are Ichidan verbs. That means there are certain words like hashiru that do end on an iru, but is not an Ichidan verb. This means that the main takeaway is that if the verb does not end with iru or eru, it is 100% not an Ichidan verb. If it does end with iru and eru, then it is most likely an Ichidan verb, but it's not always the case. I will talk more about how to differentiate iru and eru ending Godan verbs at the end of this video. The second absolute rule for Ichidan verbs is that there is only one conjugation, or otherwise you could say only one stem, hence Ichidan. What that means is that there is only one way these verbs can change, and that is to drop the ru. For example, let's take a look at taberu. There is only one way to conjugate taberu, and that is to drop the ru, which means that the conjugated form of taberu is tabe. And if we wanted to make the word more formal, we would simply add masu onto the end of the conjugated form of the verb to get tabemasu. Similarly, if I wanted to put it into its negative form, I would put the helper adjective nai onto the end of the conjugated form of the verb to get tabenai. This rule applies for every single Ichidan verb, so we can do the same thing for the aforementioned miru and kiru. First, we turn them into their conjugated forms by dropping the ru, leaving us with mi and ki. And to make this formal, we would add the helper verb mas, so we get mimas and kimas. And to make it negative, we add nai, so we get minai and kinai. Now, if any of that flew over your head a bit, feel free to just wind the video back to watch it again. Or you can consider signing up to the channel membership at the Dokyu tier to download the worksheet for the entire 4-video course and get access to all the lessons earlier. The worksheet contains more in-depth explanations on stuff like why I consider Ichidan verbs to only have one conjugation. I mean, other than the fact that it's literally in the name. And it also contains more example verbs that double check whether you really understood the contents of this video. Remember, we can only acquire languages via getting comprehensible input, as stated by Dr. Stephen Krashen. So therefore, this worksheet does not aim to increase acquisition, but instead increases comprehension. Because the more you can comprehend, the faster you can acquire. Now, you don't have to sign up for the membership if you don't want to. I make all my videos with the intention of sharing what I know for free. However, if you want that little boost to your Japanese journey while supporting the channel as well, join the Jouzu Juls YouTube membership today. The second type of verbs are Godan verbs. These are 5 stem verbs. The simplest way to tell whether something is a Godan verb is to simply check whether it's an Ichidan verb. If it is not an Ichidan verb, it is a Godan verb. This means that if you see a verb ending on u, ku, gu, tsu, bu, su, nu, or mu, you can be 100% sure that those are Godan verbs. Furthermore, if you see a verb ending on aru, uru, or oru, those cannot be Ichidan verbs and therefore must be Godan verbs. The only time you'll ever get confused is when a verb ends on iru or iru. Again, we'll talk about how to differentiate these later on. The second absolute rule for Godan verbs are that there are 5 conjugation stems, hence Godan. We can visualize the stems like this, where every verb starts with an u and it can turn into a, I, e, o, or te stems. Of course, it's not limited to just this kana itself. I'm talking about the entire row being shifted. So for example, we can take the Godan verb aruku, meaning walk. We can shift the ku here into aruka, aruki, aruke, or aruko. All of these are stem forms of aruku. And what we can do with these stems is put on the appropriate helper verbs and adjectives. For example, if I wanted to turn this formal, I would simply put aruku into its I stem, turning it into aruki, then add masu. If I wanted to say don't walk, I would have to turn aruku into its A stem, aruka, then add the helper adjective nai. I cannot attach masu to the A stem of a verb because that's not how Godan verbs work. In order for you to attach something onto the end of a verb, you must know the appropriate stem that it goes on. A detailed breakdown of every single stem and every single possible attachment will be done in the next video. Similarly, it will also apply to another Godan verb like nomu, meaning drink. First, let's break down the stems that it has. It has noma, nomi, nome, and nomo. Again, to make this formal, we have to put it into its I stem, so we would go nomi, then add masu, and if I wanted to say don't drink, I would switch it into its A stem, noma, then add the helper adjective nai. Now you'll notice that I did not include the te form, and I've only covered 4 out of the 5 stems, but this is because te form follows its own te form rules that I will be covering in the 3rd video in this series. Next, let's talk about the fukisoku doushi, or the 2 irregular verbs. Now don't worry too much about remembering them because you probably already know them and you're probably already using them. Check this out. The 2 irregular verbs are suru, do, and kuru, come. Both of these verbs end on uru, so they cannot be Ichidan verbs, which means that they must be Godan verbs. Well, let's put your instincts to a test. How do you add masu onto suru? Is it surimasu? No, you already know it is shimasu. And how do we turn suru into its negative form? Is it suranai? Nope, it is shinai. This is all basic information that you should have learned by the time you are watching this video. If you don't know this, then this video is probably too advanced for you anyway. And just to cover all the grounds, let's take a look at kuru. How do we turn kuru into formal? Is it kurimasu? No, it is not. It is kimasu. And how do we turn kuru into its negative form? Is it kuranai? Absolutely not. It is, drumroll please, konai. See, I knew you would get this correct. Again, I will cover every single conjugation in the next video, so for now, all you need to know is that suru and kuru are not Godan verbs. Okay, so with iru and eru ending Godan verbs, how do we tell them apart from Ichidan verbs? Unfortunately, the simple answer is that with a single instance of the word, there is no way to tell. For example, if I were to just show you this list and ask you which one was Ichidan and which was Godan, it would be impossible to tell. A safe answer would be to say that most of these are Ichidan, and you would be correct. The ones in green are Ichidan, the ones in red are Godan. There are some Japanese teachers that try to come up with some complex rules to tell them apart. For example, this one, nihongosensei.net, has this graph here that says that if the verb is one kanji plus a ru, then it has to be a Godan verb. However, I don't really buy into that because, I mean, some words just don't follow those rules. Furthermore, the method that I learned from Kurodali sensei works 100% of the time, and that is to simply learn another instance of the word, preferably one that uses the verb's E stem. I will elaborate more on the E stem in the next video, but for this video, all you need to know is that the E stem is also called the Great Connector, and it allows Godan verbs to connect to other words. So how can we put the E stem into use? Well, let's take a look at 2 example words. We have kiru, meaning wear, and kiru, meaning cut. Both of these are iru ending verbs, so how do we tell which one is Ichidan and which one is Godan? Well, let's take a look at another instance of the word. Here we have a word that I'm sure many people are familiar with. This is kimono, as in the thing that you wear. Ki comes from kiru, meaning wear. Mono means thing. So in order for you to stick the verb kiru onto mono, you must switch kiru into its E stem. However, because the word exists as kimono and not kirimono, we know that kiru must be an Ichidan verb. This is because if it's an Ichidan verb, all we need to do to conjugate it is drop the ru. It would not have an e stem. This is as opposed to kiru, cut, which is a Godan verb, which does have an e stem. So if we were to connect anything onto cut, we would have to switch it into kiri something. For example, we have the word kirikae, meaning to exchange something. If kiru was an Ichidan verb, it would have to be kikaeru, but it's not.
Excellent.
Another very common and useful example that we can gather from daily life is deru and iru, meaning leave and enter. Both of these end on eru and iru, so which is Godan and which is Ichidan? Well, let's take a look at another instance. Here we have deguchi, meaning exit, and iriguchi, meaning entrance. From this, we can tell that deru is an Ichidan verb, because otherwise it would not be deguchi, it would be deriguchi. And we can also tell that iru is a Godan verb, because otherwise it would not be iriguchi, it would be iguchi. Now that you know what Ichidan and Godan verbs are, you can move on to learning about what every single stem does and what you can attach to them. Click on the video on your screen right now to learn more.